During the break, you were talking about capitalism and comparing capitalism in the 1920s and 30s to capitalism today. Could you give some analysis of those differences?
Well, I think it's one of the most important questions that could be asked. We all know that there are great changes in the structure of the capitalist economy. We have more than enough parentheses around to tell us about that, and many of their analyses at times are good. Okay? And Harry Magdoff has pointed things out, and Braverman, and Monthly Review, and Sweezy, the entire group of self-styled Marxist economists, although I don't know what they would call themselves or who's alive right now, today. But I'd like to talk of one aspect that I think is particularly important. In the 1930s, capitalism was surely a dominant economy. That is to say, in the factories, in the factories and transportation and mining, and to a growing extent clearly in agriculture, in such ordinary little shops that my parents worked in, notably in the garment district in New York. You had a form of capitalism that was more personified and, very importantly, economically together, so to speak. But it was above all an economy. After you went into that economy and worked during the day, if you were a worker at that time, you came back home to a very different world. You had, within the economic sphere, you had capitalism. But within your neighborhood or within your town, village, you came back to a different world entirely. You still had the old-style families, presumably patriarchal, although in many cases, as I know in my family, women played a decisive role in the home. If they were locked into the home, they were also locked out of capitalism. And there you had at least 3 generations. That was my experience. And my family was relatively unstable by comparison with others. You had your grandmother, as I did, living with you. You had your parents. And then there were people who were your peers or siblings. So you went from a highly industrialized or relatively industrialized world while you were working back to a pre-capitalist world. And this pre-capitalist world could have very well have existed 200 years ago or 300 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution. You had markets, family, you know what I mean, family shops, in which people lived, by the way, in the back of the store. They had their apartments there. That sold you your vegetables and your fruit. And then you went to another shop, much the same like the vegetable and fruit store. And you went to the butcher. And there you bought only meat. And then you went to the poultry store, and there you bought only poultry. And then you went to the fish store, and you bought only fish. And you went to the bakery. And on and on and on it went. And you had workers sitting there, actually handicraft workers, making cigars in the window. It used to enchant us as kids. But there they were, making these cigars in the window, rolling up leaves. And they used to play tricks with us, you know, to amuse us, to show how deft and skillful they were. And they chortled with each other as we watched them. And you could go in and buy a suit, and it would be tailor-made. The tailor would buy all the cloth that he needed, and then measure you, and then make the suit for you. And many other clothing articles were exactly bought that way. And you had hat stores and shoe stores, and I can go on and on and on. And cobblers could even make shoes for you. Now, that was a world that could have existed in the 12th century, you know what I'm saying? And you played in a neighborhood that was very much intact as a community, even in New York City. As I told you, New York in my day, as a youth and as a child, was made up of 1,000 villages. And they had all the smells and odors and feeling of an old world. And people thought not in the exact analyses of, surplus value and labor theory of value. They thought in terms of the rich and the poor. That's the way they saw it. They saw themselves as workers, and they saw the others as capitalists. But the word capitalist was interchangeable with rich. And the word worker was interchangeable with poor. Or they had exploiters and exploited. And very commonly used word at that time was toilers. Not just workers, and not just poor, and not just exploited, but toilers, T-O-I-L-E-R-S, a word that's virtually disappeared from our vocabulary. And people were intensely class conscious of that. They were intensely class conscious of the fact that even if they were well off, they were exploited. That they knew. They knew who was the boss and who was not. And they knew that a marked distinction existed between the two, which appeared not only in behavior patterns, but even in the way one wore clothing. One wore snap caps if one was a worker. You've seen them in movies like The Sting, you know, and usually pulled down jauntily on the side. One wore leather jackets, sheepskin. In those days, they were very inexpensive. Now, I take it, they're very exotic and high-priced. You wore high shoes when I was young, you know, what you'd call work shoes. I don't know what you'd call them today any longer. And you had a different way of walking, of dressing. And you were very plainly not among the wealthy. That was clear. And you had that sense of solidarity, an intense sense of solidarity. First of all, most of the people I knew, despite the fact that they came from European countries with distinctive languages, different from that of other Americans in many cases, different from that of even other immigrants. You had a little Israel, if you want to call it that. You had a little Italy, if you want to call it that. You had a little Ireland, if you want to call it that. You even had white Anglo-Saxon areas that were questionable. They were poor whites. You see what I'm saying? And it was an intense sense of solidarity, which I remember. And I loved it. When Sacco and Vanzetti were electrocuted, and I was a kid at that point, I was awakened, and my grandmother cried out to me, and I'll never forget this memory. 1926, 27, I'm 5, 6 years old, but there are things that stick in your mind. And my grandmother waved the newspaper in front of me, because they had, if my memory is correct, sketches of them both in the electric chair. They were not photographs, but sketches. They seem to have had the capacity to run off 2 editions. If they were not electrocuted, they had one headline. If they were electrocuted, they had another. That is, if they were pardoned or their electrocution was deferred. Although it was almost certain by then that they were going to be electrocuted. And they had kids running around, extra, extra, Sacco and Vanzetti electrocuted, and all the lights in the neighborhood went on. And everybody came out. And this was a Jewish neighborhood, and those were 2 Italian anarchists. And people were weeping. And my grandmother's tears were running down her eyes, and my mother's tears were running down her eyes. And this, my grandmother said to me, is what they do to 2 ordinary workers. Remember that. This is what they do to ordinary workers, 2 Italian workers. That sense of solidarity was immense. So you had this tension, very powerful tension, between an old world, pre-industrial, and at the same time intensely class conscious, and an industrial world that was only part of your life. It was not your life. So capitalism did not penetrate into society. It did not become an everyday form of life. What happened has happened since the end of the Second World War, through the 50s and into the 60s and 70s, and especially now, is that capitalism has turned from a capitalist market into a capitalist society. Now, people think as though they were in the market, as though they were involved in business. They invest in their marriages. They invest in their children. Listen to the language